So another day and another piece of questionable journalism by a BBC presenter. This time she is Martine Croxall, who was in the news last week for wrong reasons. Her conduct and questioning had come under sharp scrutiny when she interviewed a Palestinian journalist on Israeli terrorism in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. You can see that interview here. This time, she is facing even more criticism for her interview with another Palestinian guest, MP Mustafa Barghouti. The context was the Israeli terrorist causing carnage by murdering a number of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank by conducting aerial strikes. Yes, the occupied West Bank, not Gaza. There is no Hamas bogey here. So you would think that even a BBC presenter would find it hard to justify Israeli war crimes. But that's not what we saw in Martine Croxall's interview with Mustafa Barghouti. She didn't forget to add that, and I quote, Israel says that the target in the West Bank was command room, a terror cell. Don't take my word for it. Watch it for yourself.
In Gaza, the IDF say that they give warnings to civilians when they're about to launch a strike. To what extent, if any, does that happen in the West Bank?
Well, I don't believe they do that in Gaza, but they definitely don't do any of that in the West Bank. People suddenly find themselves subjected to airstrikes. It is important to remember that West Bank is an occupied territory by Israeli army since 57 years. And when Israel uses airstrikes against occupied people, it is a total violation of international law. Since the 7th of October, Israel conducted 80 airstrikes on different places in the West Bank, mainly in refugee camps like Nur Shams and Tulkarim refugee camp. The outcome is that 640 people have been killed, including no less than 170 children. And all these 80 airstrikes, during these attacks, there were no warnings whatsoever.
Israel says that the target in the West Bank was a command room of a terror cell, is how they've described it.
If she was so concerned about putting the Israeli version out, shouldn't she have also stated what international laws and UN resolutions have to say on the armed resistance against occupying power? Because without this, she will be accused of shamelessly batting for Israel. Let me educate her on what the UN resolution says. The resolution 3743 clearly states, and I quote, considering that the denial of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, sovereignty, independence, and return to Palestine and the repeated acts of aggression by Israel against the peoples of the region constitutes a serious threat to international peace and security. That's the UN words. Maybe Martine Croxall needs to spend some time educating herself about international law. Because if she did, she would know that this resolution also reaffirmed, and I quote, the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means. By all available means, including armed struggle. That's not my words. That's again the words stated by the United Nations, the members of the United Nations. A court, no less than the International Court of Justice, recently ruled that Israel was an illegal occupier of Palestinian land. This happened only a few weeks ago. Maybe Croxall's news channel, which is the BBC, did not broadcast it because this wasn't suiting the agenda, or it was hurting Israeli interests. But I advise her to educate herself on this unless she has an agenda to peddle here. Because she's disgracing herself with such conduct time and again, and I'm not liking it. I'm not liking it also because she was my former colleague, and when I made my first appearance on BBC TV as a correspondent, it was she who was presenting the show. She earns a lot of money In fact, she has even gone to the tribunal against the BBC because she wasn't happy with what she was being paid. Hope she realizes that people like myself and million others in this country pay to fund her salary and salaries of other BBC staff members. We do that despite facing tough times financially at home. So I find it very, very infuriating to see such lapses being repeated time and again. I refuse to believe that she hasn't learned the art of conducting objective interviews, despite being with the BBC for 2 decades. Last week, she was giving grief to a Palestinian journalist unfairly.
So you have these Israeli policymakers essentially enforcing a genocide just a couple of dozen kilometers west of the West Bank, and at the same time saying, oh, this is abhorrent, or we condemn this act. And again, you need to remember that these settlers are part of the Israeli system, that the Israeli government has placed them illegally in the West Bank as part of the annexation. Now, the condemnation from Israeli policymakers comes from the strategy within the Israeli military, and that is called perception shaping. And it is a policy that they enforce in order to maintain a image of being a moral army, or being a regime that values human life and values legal regulation.
I just must go back to a word that you used a moment ago. It is a fact that many international members of the international community regard these settlements as illegal, but you just used the word genocide. Is that in relation to what's happening in the West Bank? Are you really using that word?
So I'm speaking about the genocide that is happening in Gaza. Now, what is happening in Palestine, and you need to remember, Gaza is not a separate entity from Palestine, which seems to be the trend in media. Israel is enforcing spatiocide, and that includes the annexation of territory and the depopulation of villages. In the West Bank, we have witnessed an unprecedented rate of Israeli settler annexation of Palestinian lands and actual depopulation of towns and areas within the West Bank. So that does fall within the overall Israeli strategy of ethnic cleansing. And if that word makes you uncomfortable, I recommend that you go and actually see what ethnic cleansing means, because Israel has de facto implemented every part of what that phrase entails.
Well, of course,
so yes, I do place it in that same category.
Well, of course, Israel would deny that completely, and even members of the international community would challenge some of what you've just said. What is the mood? What is the anticipation, though, in the West Bank of what might happen next, and how is the temperature lowered? Just briefly, if you would.
Of course, Israel would refute that in parts of the international community. Like I said, this is part of Israel's perception shaping strategy.
Can we move on to the question? The question. Sorry, Mariam,
my
question is, what's the anticipation in the West Bank of what might happen next, and what needs to happen to bring the temperature down?
Right. So the anticipation in the West Bank is part of how you just responded to me. So Palestinians are expecting, especially international media correspondents, to devalue what is happening here and semi-legitimize it.
I didn't do that at all. I'm sorry, Mariam, I did not do that at all. I did not do that at all. I'm asking you to tell me what the anticipation is. I'm asking you to tell me what the mood is and the anticipation is of Palestinians in the West Bank. That isn't devaluing anything that has happened at all. And we have just reported that the British Foreign Secretary has condemned the settler violence. Please answer my question.
As I said, perception shaping. You can go back to this interview and see how you devalued it.
Not too long ago, she was being admonished by George Galloway, who called out her pro-Labour biases.
We are actually the victims of that dirty trick approach to politics. The Kirklees Council, a Labour council, has in the last 48 hours removed at least 2,000 of our posters from lampposts.
We've seen a lot of your posters. There's no doubt that you're making a real impression here. But why have you come to stand in this seat? You have nothing to do with this particular seat.
Would you ask that of any of the other candidates?
Yes,
why have they come to stand in this seat? Because there's an election. And the
but
election,
you're not a local man. Why wouldn't somebody vote for Kim Leadbeater, who is born and bred here and knows the constituency very well?
Is there any need for me in this interview, or are you just going to give a party political broadcast?
But some of your campaign is surely about getting rid of Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party.
Sure.
You've spoken about that.
Sure.
And you've talked about yourself being a revolutionary in the past. This kind of revolution, though, is a negative one, surely. What are your positive goals, other than trying to bring down the Labour leader?
I ask again, is there any point in me being in this interview? This is a party political broadcast.
George Galloway from the Workers' Party, thank you very much for talking to us.
I'd be lying if I said thank you back.
That's okay. That's fine. You came, you talked to us.
Mustafa Barghouti, Miriam Barghouti, George Galloway. Can you detect a Palestinian theme here? An obvious Israeli link or a mere coincidence? She should explain, because that's the impression she is giving. Great that she is ever so quick to highlight how Israelis would have justified the act of terror. But why does she not show a similar promptness in highlighting what the UN resolutions say about the armed resistance of those under occupation, or what the topmost court of the world says on the illegal occupation of Israel, and what the Article 2 and Article 4 of the Geneva Convention say about rights of those being illegally occupied? Come on, Croxall, you can do better. You have a chance to redeem yourself. The victims of Israeli terrorism in Gaza and occupied West Bank are real people. They are being brutalized every second, every hour, every day. Even Israelis don't deny this anymore. A criminal, Bezalel Smotrich, who was convicted for brutalizing Palestinians by an Israeli court, he is now a powerful minister in the Israeli government. Do you know how difficult it is for a compromised Israeli court to convict its own people for brutalizing Palestinians? And you don't see a reason to highlight their version, their rights, in the same way that you do for Israelis? I look forward to better journalism, improved journalism from you. That's it from me. I am touched by your support to this platform and our independent journalism on buymeacoffee.com. If you too think this journalism is worth supporting, then you too can buy me a coffee. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.